let's get started. Our penultimate panel is Protecting Rule of Law, Human Rights, and Democratic Institutions. And moderating it is John Glenn, my old friend from GMF and now with the National Endowment for Democracy. John.
Thank you, David. I'm going to stand up just for a moment because we're kind of at that minute and that time of the day where everybody is getting a little tired. We've got a lot, but we want to get us through the finish line. So what I want to do here is this panel on protecting human rights and rule of law is one of these places where it feels like it comes at the right time. We've had a day and a half of, I would say, amazing analysis of a lot of these issues. But this is my first time here, and I've heard and know that Senator McCain, who passed 5 years ago recently, was an inspiration for this conference, and it reminded me of a story I've always heard my colleagues who work with the senator say. He would begin the meetings by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the world is on fire. What are we going to do about it?" That's what I want to turn us to here. We've had conversations about a range of things. We should be dealing with things in the military realm, in the diplomatic realm. I want to elevate our conversation on democracy. We have a remarkable panel. We've got folks who work in the donor community. We've got folks who work on criminology and criminal justice, the legal sector. We've got longtime folks, Miranda here, who works on independent journalism and corruption. I'll introduce them to you briefly. But all of these are part of the toolkit about how we think about supporting democracy. I want to begin, of course, with the caveat. Yesterday's panel, fabulous discussion with Georgian civil society. We heard them clearly. They said, this is our fight. Our job is to think about how can we help them. So quickly, to my left, I have Michal Baranowski. You've heard from him a number of times in the Q&A session. He's the director of the German Marshall Fund. We don't say the director of the office in Warsaw anymore. You are the managing director
GMF East.
GMF East.
The empire has grown, yes.
Next to him, I have Besiki Kutateladze, who is from Florida International University and a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Next to him, Steve Nix from IRI, well known to many of our community. He is the regional program director for Eurasia, where he oversees programs in, I had to get the list right, Belarus, Georgia, Kyrgyz Republic, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine.
Yes.
The easy cases.
Yes.
Lastly, but certainly not least, Miranda Patrucic. It's so great to have you with us. Miranda's with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. I had to write that because I know them simply as OCCRP. She deserves some congratulations. She's recently been promoted to the editor-in-chief this year, which apparently has made things a little bit more complicated. So what I want to do with us, as I've told the panelists, I think we have just under an hour. So I want to do two things. I want to talk about lessons learned, and I want to look forward. Let's start with lessons learned, folks. I've talked to you all about how I think part of what we have incumbent upon us now is to reflect on the last 15, 16 years that Freedom House calls a period of democratic decline. This toolkit of rule of law, democracy, corruption, independent judiciary, I think most of us know, this was developed in the 1990s at a period when it was a different set of assumptions about which way the world would go. We heard a little bit of that in the Russia panel. And what I want to do is I want to ask us and ask my colleagues to think about how, regrettably, this work has gotten harder over the past years. And I want to ask us to raise a challenge to ourselves, start with one saying, what have you seen over the past 15, 16 years of your work, and how have we either adapted, or what do we need to do to rise to meet today's challenge? Why don't I just come down the list for this time? Michal, would you like to start?
Sure. Wonderful to be with you, John, with you all survivors of the heat. We are almost there. So thanks for being with us. What we are seeing? Well, I'm coming to you from Warsaw. So this is also, I'm going to speak a little bit from my perspective, being on the front line, geopolitical front line, very near the war in Ukraine, but also, frankly, being on the democracy front line struggle on the eve of elections that are most likely are not going to be free and fair. A variety of reasons. We can go back to it. So, where are we? First of all, we are struggling with democracy in places that 10, 15 years ago, we didn't think we would struggle. US aid is back in Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary is not the only case. Poland now is a big case where the West, United States, Europe, has to invest in civil society, has to push for the rule of law, because things have not just been hunky-dory after we joined the EU. What's very clear to me is that in the past, we were looking to strengthen democracy. The West was able to go beyond its family. I think the number one challenge for us is to clean up at home. I can speak to my own country. Unfortunately, United States has big issues as well, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you, because if United States was to fail over time in democratic standards, the whole rest of the West, democratic West, would be in trouble. But I think cleaning up at home and keeping ourselves to the standards within this global West that we have been discussing is critical. And here, I think the one tool, because you ask, okay, and I will stop perhaps at this, the one tool that we have been a little bit too timid to use, or at least the way I see it, from close up, again in my home country, is recognizing the leverage that U.S. government has when dealing with governments that are saying that they are playing ball on democracy, but they are actually not playing ball. Supporting only civil society might not be enough. We are here in Georgia for now a couple days. I will be leaving later tonight or tomorrow, not convinced that it's going to be an easy lift for Georgian civil society, Georgian opposition party to have free and fair election by themselves. You Georgians are telling us this is our fight. Yes, it is, but we really need to step much deeper, because the other side, in your case, your government, in my case, current government in Poland, is learning how to tilt the playing field. And I think it is in real interests of the United States, of the EU, of the global West, to make sure that the playing field is as much even as possible, and then have the fair political competition among real, more equal competitors. Let me stop here.
No, I really think this issue about how our competitors are learning is one of those things that we need to be integrating into our own work. Besiki, let me turn to you. You, I noticed in your background, have done a bunch of work on UN rule of law indicators. I don't know, I mean, that might be relevant to your comments, but I'd be interested in how you've seen these years and the work that you've been able to accomplish.
Great. Hello, everyone. I brought humidity and heat from Miami, so here we go.
Thank you.
And maybe some of the aspects of bad governance from Florida. We've been talking about what's been happening over the past 15 years, but maybe now we should also go back 30 years, especially September marks 30 years from the fall of Sukhumi. As we know, in Abkhazia, Russia perpetrated genocidal war, where nearly 6,000 ethnic Georgians have died brutally. Many of them were raped, and more than 300,000 people were forced to leave their homes and not being able to return. So, in fact, behind me in the Stamba Hotel, I just want to echo what Giga was saying, Bokaria saying earlier, there is a great exhibit. I really encourage you to take 20 minutes and go and see the exhibit. It's very graphic, it's disturbing, but I think it's an important reminder what Russia has been capable of. So as it comes to the progress maybe that has been made, I lived here in the 90s. I'm ethnic Georgian, I'm Georgian American. It was a really dark times, literally and figuratively. We had no power, we had no food, and there was a rampant corruption in every segment of the government, including the justice system, obviously. Fast forward a couple of decades, there are, as frustrated we are with the lack of progress and perhaps with some regress we're seeing in recent years, Georgia has accomplished a lot. We, in criminal justice, I don't teach much, but when we teach criminal justice courses in the United States, one of the successful case studies of policing reform comes from Georgia, where we also have to teach students that actually Georgia, the country, not the state. And after the killing of George Floyd in the United States, many criminal justice professionals, policymakers were reaching out to me because I'm Georgian. I specialize in prosecution, but because I'm Georgian, trying to learn about the reform that was carried out in Georgia. That is an incredible success story. And despite all the odds against them, Georgia still has very vibrant civil society. And the panel from yesterday was absolutely amazing, and you referenced that. We do have several independent critical news channels that cover stories from multiple angles, including journalistic investigations, and you'll talk about this a little bit. And we do have fairly strong opposition parties, despite all the criticisms they are getting. The opposition leaders that have very difficult year ahead of them, and in addition to the criticisms they get plenty of, they probably also need a lot of encouragement, they need a lot of support, especially from the Western partners, to enable the people of Georgia to voice their concerns and go and vote, so for this election to be meaningful. So those are all excellent developments. But there have been tremendous setbacks. We have a high level of homophobia in the country, and then individuals who are constantly and consistently attack LGBT groups are not held accountable. This is actually one of the recommendations set forth by European Union to protect the minority rights. Lazare Grigoriade is a 22-year-old Georgian who is in pretrial detention for protesting in March against so-called anti-foreign agent law. And he faces up to 12 years, 11, 12 years of imprisonment for basically looking different, whom the Prime Minister referred to as somebody with so-called confused orientation, just sending these homophobic messages and very closely in aligning with what we've been hearing from the Kremlin. So, as I got the invitation to this conference, I was thrilled. I want to be here, I want to support, but I also was asking myself the question, does it even make sense to be talking about the rule of law reform, justice reform, under the circumstances when all branches of the government are fully in clutches of Georgian dream, including the judiciary? Are meaningful reforms even possible? And as you think about it, the international development background kept telling me, just referencing to the work you mentioned, kept telling me, whispering in my ear that the time for reforms is always now. We cannot tell the victims of domestic violence or sexual assault, many of them who are children, or homophobic attacks, etc., that they should wait and vote to change their futures. I think as we're approaching 2024, and I'm hoping I'll get a chance to talk about this a little more, we need to come up with more specific ideas how we're going to reform the criminal justice system. And be at the same time bold but measured. And I know it sounds oxymoronic, but the favorite pastime of Georgians has been just referencing things that may work in the United States or Europe, often forgetting that Georgia is a new democracy, and things that may work in well-oiled system of checks and balances may not work equally well in Georgia. So it's something to remember as we're discussing today what the future may hold.
Thank you very, very much. Steve, I introduced you from IRI and your work there, but your background also includes some work quite up close in Ukraine on a number of really key elements of their sort of democratic processes and institutions. Share with me, I'd really be interested in sort of your view of how we look at this question about how we adapt and change given the democratic decline we've observed.
Sure. Thank you, John. Well, first of all, I'd like to say to the audience, it's such a great honor to be invited to participate in this event. And my thanks go out to the McCain Institute. So proud to be associated with this organization. As many of you know, Senator McCain chaired the International Republican Institute for 25 years. He was our leader. He hired me in this position over 20 years ago. So what we do at IRI in the Eurasia Division, we hope is reflective of what John McCain would want us to do, and it's our way of continuing his legacy. So thank you again, David and Nino, for including me. Very, very proud to be here today with you. Okay, with regard to your question, remember we're practitioners. We are men and women at IRI of action, not reflection. As you pointed out, Senator McCain would ask me when I would give him a report, his response would be, yes, Steve, I know what the problem is. What are we doing about it? Exactly what you said. So what are we doing and what have we learned? Just real quickly, I was honored to be outside legal counsel to the Ukrainian Rada. I had the privilege and honor of working on the draft constitution of Ukraine, the election laws, the law on the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, which was created by the Constitution. So a lot of legislative drafting. And I'll use Ukraine as the case in point of what we've learned. Again, I think we became very adept at leveling the playing field and having competitive elections with good results that resulted in transitions to pro-EU, pro-reform governments. What we've learned is that's not enough. And the important thing is that once these transitions take place, we need investment of time and people in building, continuing to build democratic structures. What do I mean by that? An effective and responsive executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. That's what we strive to achieve. That's what we need. And that's what we learned, and probably from the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, that we needed to do more of. So, for example, after the transition in Moldova, we've worked very hard with the government to try to help them build their legislative agenda, their reform agenda, communicate that to the public. We're doing that in a number of different countries in Ukraine. People forget that decentralization was also, along with EU membership, one of the goals of the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity. So we've worked very hard since then to build accountability and governance at the local level. That's a very, very important to the reform. Speakers earlier noted that Ukraine, while it's fighting a full-scale war against a formidable military foe, is continuing their reform agenda, and we're trying to do that. So I think the important point to make is it's one thing to have a good electoral outcome. It's another thing to follow up with building democratic institutions that survive subsequent electoral outcomes. I'm used to arguing before judges, and they always cut me off after 3 minutes.
Thank you, Counselor.
So I'll stop there, but happy to answer questions
You
later.
put out some really critical pieces. I really appreciate it. But Miranda, I'm such a fan of OCCRP's work, in part because I feel like it's been helping us understand the modern nature of corruption. And the more I've looked at that issue, the powerful have been stealing from the poor forever. But the work that you've done has really highlighted the transnational nature of this work and the way that it isn't just something people are doing in other countries and other places, but actually using the international financial system and implicating democratic societies. But how have you seen this evolution in recent bits?
So I'll start by saying one thing, which is, the last wound that Putin gave to the democracy in Russia was basically completely shutting down media. That's where it was game over, when all of the independent media had to leave the country. And I think this is really important sign that basically this is the last thing that go. If you look at the countries that are now going, down the hill, Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, one of the democratic countries in Central Asia, the government is just make a move to close down one of the main independent media organizations in the country, using courts to do so. So that's the downside. But I think over the years, one thing that I think is a positive and is something to look for the future is the fact that journalists have discovered collaboration. We have discovered that we can be far more effective working together across border than actually law enforcement. Because law enforcement has all these rules. They have to ask for international legal assistance, they have to write letters, they have to hope that somebody will respond. All I need to do is make a phone call and ask a journalist in UK, can you help me? So I think this is amazing development. And I think, one of the facts is that the international investigative journalism community has significantly grown thanks to investments by, range of donors and the fact that we were able to train and develop journalists and that, journalism is not dependent on reporters from, US, UK, the long-time democracies basically reporting about our countries. We have reporters here in Georgia who are able to uncover the corruption locally and also work with the colleagues internationally and basically bring these stories to the attention. So that's a great development. I also want to point about another thing. This is something that my organization has done, and I think it's a game changer, which is traditionally media have only done media work, publish the story and let the impact happen on its own. OCCRP has started something called Global Anti-Corruption Consortium, which is our partnership with Transparency International, which we also hope to expand beyond this organization, where basically we are doing investigations and they're actively looking into what we are publishing and thinking about what they can do with it. And that means, and I'll give you, Turkmenistan, a country most people don't even know where it is, right? Nobody cares about it. We did a story showing how the relatives of the president basically were importing rationed food in the country. They looked at the story and they were thinking, well, there is something I can do. There's a UK company that played a role. I can bring this case to the NCA. And I think this is really powerful because, one bad thing that happened with the media is that we all became so competitive that when the news of corruption breaks, it's usually just single media who publishes it and everybody else stays silent. And this is the way to basically break that wall and really try to impact, beyond basically publishing. So those are the bright sides of our problems.
It's terrific. I mean, this question of new forms of collaboration has got to be at the heart of this because these problems don't fit into neat boxes. Second question before I turn to you all. Let's look forward. With respect to the organizers, I think as we talked, it was about protecting rule of law and human rights, essential work. But in today's era, I'm not sure it's enough to have a defensive approach. There are others now, in a way that may not have been in the 1990s when some of us began in this work, offering an alternative, a highly resourced alternative. And I think we have to do better at making a case about what our vision for a democratic future is and how countries and citizens fit into it. And it's not enough for us to be like the traditional tourist who, when encountering incomprehension when trying to use their native tongue abroad, says, I'll just repeat it and louder. Let's not, though, this isn't our audience for that. These folks, I bet, understand this. Let me ask you in thinking, how do you articulate that positive vision in today's world where there are rising authoritarian powers offering alternatives? How do you do so in a way, not to convince us, but to really talk about a vision that could compel the kind of partners around the world to be able to reverse this democratic decline? I can do it how you like it. Michal, give us a start.
I don't want to start, John. This is such a good question and such a tough answer. I mean, I honestly don't have a very good answer beyond the fact that for countries that it used to be very black and white, it stopped being so black and white. You can be both prosperous and a little bit less democratic. You can have some level of decent institutions that work decently, but over time, a little bit less so. What Stephen said, that the work does not stop at the moment of a transition. It did not stop. We thought it stopped. It will be enough for Central and Eastern Europe when we joined the EU. We probably think the same for when it comes to Ukraine, Moldova, Western Balkans when they joined the EU. We actually know now this is not where it stops. Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that clearly both the EU and the US has been failing in this sort of not only explaining but actually because telling the story is one thing, but then you have to speak softly but carry the big stick. And we have been less effective in the conditionality for members of our clubs. It's harder. In the currently the U.S. administration that put, let's also remember, the Biden administration put democracy in the center of its foreign policy.
Right.
We had a dinner last night where it's very clear that that's much more on the rhetorics side rather than in real implementation. And part of this, and we are, and the governments are operating in this, in a moment of geopolitical tension when they often perceive there is a dilemma between either doing the right thing on democracy or doing the right thing on foreign policy. And they are choosing foreign policy, forgetting about democracy. And I know that we'll never live in this perfect world power, especially global power like the US, can be fully consistent. But I think some of the dilemma, especially as EU, US is looking within the club, the dilemma should not be there. It's not there, in fact. It's just a perception, misperception. So, some of that work is a step beyond what the community, including the democratic governments, have been willing to do right now, even though it's very, very hard.
I think you raise a really important point. It almost feels like that tension's existed from the beginning, interests and values, and for a long time people have said that's a false choice, but it might have gotten harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a certain sense where we are.
So, I'm not a politician or political scientist even, so I tend to get into the weeds as I think about what can be done, and I think about this quite often. So one of the 12 points set as a condition by European Union is to build truly and fully independent judiciary. So the idea that somebody had to write for you that it has to be truly independent as opposed to independent as you describe is quite telling. So there have been, so I spent a couple of months in Georgia, so there have been some interesting ideas about how we can create the independence of the judiciary. One of the ideas was possibly electing prosecutors, since I do the prosecutorial reform. And in the United States, we do elect prosecutors. There are more than 2,300 local prosecutors called district attorneys, state attorneys, depending on the jurisdiction. So they are elected locally. And obviously, this gives them a lot of independence, power. They can go after corrupt officials. And that was the design. Initially, I was not a big fan of this when I first moved to the US, but I understand the logic behind it. Can this work in Georgia? Possibly, once the election system is fixed, because right now, electing the prosecutor, whether it's attorney general or equivalent or lower prosecutors in the regions, it will be the same as appointing them. I've been also thinking about the criminal syndicates who have been in cahoots with Georgian Dream being somehow involved in that process. So at least we need to be thinking about it. Another idea is expanding the jury trials. And this has been mentioned in the context of Lazarus' case, as I mentioned earlier, that the kid that has been in pretrial detention for being arrested during the protests. Currently, number of years, Georgia has been experimenting with jury trials. The criminal procedure law requires that in consultation between the defense counsel, prosecutor, the judge, we select 12 jurors and 2 alternates out of the pool of 300. And there is a process of removing potential candidates if they're biased for cause or so-called peremptory challenges, which is you don't have to mention the cause. In the United States, we have that. Actually, I've learned last week that the UK got rid of peremptory challenges. Oh. So every removal of the juror needs to be fully explained. But here also in Georgia, if the judge is going to have tremendous ability to select a pool of jurors favorable for prosecution if there are direct requests for doing so, because the defense counsel can remove maybe 3 out of a few dozen, and that's not going to give defense counsel the power to assemble the pool of jurors. So where does it? There are a number of other ideas. I'm not going to get farther into the weeds, but I know that Georgia, as we mentioned, and that became obvious also yesterday, has a very strong civil society. That has been the case, and largely due to the support of our friends from Europe and the United States. And there gotta be the way to have the civil society play a bigger role in ensuring at least prosecutorial independence, to avoid politically motivated prosecutions, selective justice, etc. So I'm thinking that Georgia should consider building a civil society advisory board. So that can be a board of maybe 15, 20 prominent and reputable civil society members who should have the authority to withdraw a case from prosecutor, request a case, whether it's a pending or disposed of, conduct an independent evaluation, and if the board decides that the case was fully or partially politically motivated, they should have the power to force the prosecutor's office to dismiss the case. And there will be questions, obviously, how we're going to assemble the board, how we're going to sustain it, how we're going to fund it, all of those questions. Those are big questions that can be managed. But beyond this, and this can be a temporary solution until judiciary has the backbone strong enough to resist to those external pressures that are coming their way. And we have a lot of great people within the judiciary, in the prosecutorial system, like to paint everyone with one stroke, with one brush. I don't think it's going to be fair. But they also need support. So I think let's just consider using what we have powerful, well-established, where communities and society at large has some confidence in, and use them to create the oversight bodies over the judiciary and the prosecution.
Build on what we have.
Yeah. And it's actually can be quite appealing to Georgian Dream, because Georgian Dream needs to understand that they're not going to hold this power indefinitely. Sooner or later, there will be politically motivated prosecutions. And I would say that's something that can be discussed with them. Although it's easy for me to say, I'm an academic, I'm flying back in a couple of days.
Steve, we talk a lot at the Ned family about getting off our back foot. What's your take on that? How do we do that?
Well, I feel we have to be aggressive, we have to be proactive, and here's a couple of examples as I talked about these elections and transitions. We've really targeted in the Eurasia region the 3 candidate countries for EU accession. Very, very important that they continue to build their democratic institutions. We need to do, all of us, not just IRI, but everyone here, to help these countries further integrate into the EU. And what does that mean? Again, we're helping Maya Sandu with her reform agenda, trying to fulfill the steps that are required by the EU. Similarly, in Ukraine, helping local governance and many other aspects of what President Zelensky is trying to do with his reform agenda. And then obviously in Georgia, working very hard to move forward for candidate status in Georgia to help Georgia achieve the 12 steps that are being required. It's all very, very important work. But I'm going to go back to elections, which again are not an end in itself, but we've got very important elections coming up very soon. Next year, Maya Sandu will stand for re-election against someone that we assess will be not a pro-EU, pro-reform candidate, in fact, somewhat covertly a pro-Russian candidate. That's a critical election that has to be won. Secondly, in Ukraine, the subject of elections have come up. Again, the law on, martial law on mobilization prohibits Ukraine from having elections. But some people have started to make a demand of President Zelensky. I thought Zelensky's response was perfect. He said to people who requested, yes, we'll hold elections when we can, legally, but we want to make sure that everybody can vote. That means IDPs, that means people living in foreign countries, and also our soldiers fighting at the front line. And when you provide the funding that will allow us to do all those things, yes, we'll have elections. And again, I have to credit Zelensky. We do polling for President Zelensky. We've done 3 polls since the war started. In all 3 polls, President Zelensky enjoys a 91% job approval reading. Let me repeat that. All 3 polls, 91, 91, 91. Statistically, we've never seen this happen before. So numbers so high and so consistent. So President Zelensky didn't say to these questioners, well, we know what the outcome is going to be, so why am I having elections? That's something that Nazarbayev would have said, right?
Right.
But I credit it, so we've got important elections coming up here. Yeah. And toward that end, we're working with the various parties to help prepare them. IRI is investing a lot of its assets in long-term election observation. Mm-hmm. So we anticipate having between 30 and 40 long-term observers here in August prior to the elections. We feel that that will help level the playing field and help enable the Georgian government to administer a very good election. So again, focus on democracy building, democracy institutions long term. In the short term, we've got some very, very critical elections coming up in the region.
Thank you. Before I turn to Miranda, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Gather your thoughts. Miranda, if I can, I just can't resist from saying, being a journalist, I always think your field has taught me a lot about, it's not just enough to talk about facts, but you need a narrative that will really tell why this matters in a certain sense. But share with me your own thoughts about how one makes this kind of proactive, forward-looking case.
So I'll share a few thoughts. One is that, we recently, a couple of months ago, worked with our member center here, Studio Monitori, on a big investigation into several judges who had unexplained wealth. What didn't happen is that they resigned, but what did happen is they were sanctioned by US. And I do think that this is a really important thing where, if the country is not taking accountability, the other countries should say, we don't want to deal with these people. And I think when we were talking about black and white and there's too much gray, this is exactly an example of where there's too much gray. Yes, you're known for corruption. Yes, things are bad, but you're welcome in our office. So that's one thing. The other thing is I want to say is that accountability should be cool again. Because I think at some point it stopped being cool. 20 years ago, when I was a student at a business school in Sarajevo, I was actually reading a lot about, we had a class called crisis management. And we were reading a lot about, US president that admitted to things, about the US companies that admitted to things. And I was thinking, wow, this is really cool. Because it's in the human nature to be corrupt. I mean, not in everybody's, but not everybody has a level of integrity. So yes, it's expected, president will steal money in some countries. Yes, the, minister will take a bribe. But, I always thought, from those cases, well, in US, look, these people admit to it, take responsibility for what they've done, and they leave the job, leave the post, do what's right. And I feel like one thing that, we have done bad in these years is that it stopped being, doing the right thing stopped being the case. In democracy and even more in non-democracies. And, worse of it, if you think about judicial, responsibility, if somebody's under investigation, it became very normal for the rulers of the country to come out and say, this person is innocent and this is a political or, for some other reason, prosecution. That is so wrong. Because it sends a message, it is okay, you'll get away with stuff. And unfortunately, in today's time, we get away with stuff too much. So I wanted to, this is kind of I see this as, one thing we can do. Maybe, yes, we will not say, okay, Mr. Aliyev, I'm not going to meet you because I have other interests. But then there are people at, lower level position where we can say, no, you're not welcome. We can name and shame, which is another thing we stopped doing. We are not shaming in public as much. And we are sending with this message, it's fine. You're fine. Keep doing what you're doing. It's in your country, it's your problem, it's not ours problem. And then I think what's really important journalistically, we as journalists, there's, one thing we have as a saying in investigative reporting, don't cut, kill. And of course, we don't kill anybody. But what it means is, when people become immune to the talk of corruption. When you break the news of corruption continuously, bit by bit by bit. And I think as journalists, we do have responsibility to stop just just doing it instantaneously, but actually dig deep. And actually, when we uncover things, really uncover them in a way that they cannot be denied, or they cannot be forgot, or that people cannot become immune on it. And I think this is really, that's one important thing. And the other thing is we have stopped as journalists showing public why they should care. And we need to, tell people why something matters, because people often forget. When you bring them news all the time and little by little, piece by piece, They don't know anymore who is affected. How does this affect our reality? What does this do to our society? And I think it's not just a matter of, countries like Georgia or my country, Bosnia. It's also a matter of the West, because one thing that the West, did not pay attention to, all these Russians were buying properties in London. The news was, well, wow, look at these prices going really high. This, building was sold for this much. Here's the billionaire row. Here's all the people who live there. But it wasn't about how some of them are corrupting the local society in UK. And this is really something important that we need to, remind people. We need to remind, public in this country, how does corruption affect you? How does the dirty money corrupt your own institution and actually spoils your own democracy? Because it does.
Powerful. Make accountability cool again, and I think that kind of boldness is probably a big part of that. We have 10 minutes for questions. Let me turn to and invite and see if we are. Hopefully we've inspired you there. One question here. Yes, please. Katie, I think it is.
Hello, Katie Kutateladze from Open Society Georgia Foundation. First of all, thanks for the great panel and very diverse and interesting. Right now I have a question to Mr. Nix. Concerning the election observation, it's good to hear that you are planning a long-term election observation in 2024. But when we were talking of the toolkit, I remember that really, I've also been working with a number of organizations like your counterpart, NDI. We really have the same toolkit for election observation that we had in 90s. And even in long-term observation missions, sometimes it's just the same. Meanwhile, the governments or parties in power, they are learning new and new methods. For example, here we have noticed that the fraud is not happening so much during the count, exactly the voting process or counting the votes, but many of it is happening just before that. On the one hand, it's pressure on the voters. On the other hand, it's maybe printing out, extra ballots or extra IDs and so on and so on. So are you thinking about applying some new techniques? Or are you thinking at least about brainstorming how the new ways of fraud could be countered? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, we are trying to think outside of the box. A couple of quick things to share with you. First of all, we have learned, this is all part of the learning process. We have assessed that when bad things do arise in elections, they generally happen during the campaign period, as you point out. So that's where the observers need to be and when they need to be, which is during the campaign. Because for years, the OSCE has learned, has tried to do more and more of this, ODIHR and other election observation missions. So the point is, get there early and stay there for the duration. That's where you're going to see if things are going in the right direction. So that's where we will be at IRI. We're working very closely with NDI. I don't want to speak for them, but they are thinking similarly. I can tell you we're working very, very closely with NDI to have a combined operation. And in terms of technologies, again, all of our election reporting is done electronically now. So again, it's not like the old days when everyone brought their paper report back and put it in a big box at the hotel when they returned to the Capitol. We have real-time reporting on election day. You basically call in your results at every polling station, so that's accumulated. We send hourly reports out to all our field teams, so you can see by graphs, here's where problems have been reported at certain polling stations. We want to apply that to the early election observation as well, to have electronic filing, real-time filing, where we can see where the problems are, whether that's geographically located or others. So that's going to be an important component of this long-term observation. And we're going to open up the conversation. We are going to do weekly reports where we're going to have a very extensive chat. We call it Georgia Watchers. We started this in the parliamentary and local elections. We extend it. So we have a chance to get this information out to a wider audience than just the usual people like those of you who are assembled here today. A wider audience so that they can understand how the campaign is proceeding, if there are problems, and where those are taking place and the type of problems. So yes, we are evolving. We need to evolve, and we need to continue to be watchful and be very creative when it comes to election observation. So thank you for that question.
Absolutely. I think the question of technology is at the key there. But Michal, yeah.
Just two thoughts on also what Steven said. I mean, one aspect that I'm seeing, and I'm sure will be relevant in Georgia, is also not to wait until after election, but actually, name and shame in the run-up too. So it's clear what's happening rather than afterwards we can say, well, too bad. These were not free and fair elections. And then the question I would have more to us and to us all here is, in the spirit of making accountability great again, I'm going to twist this a little bit, make accountability great again. What do we do then with governments that have not free and fair elections? What are the consequences? Because we are now having those in countries that are outside of our club, but are aspiring to be on the inside, but also inside our club. What are the consequences? Perhaps, can we make this a little bit more targeted? This idea of having, what Miranda has pointed out, the targeted personal sanctions. In the end, when you know that if you screw up, you're going to be held accountable personally. Well, that'll be great. I'm not sure if we can do it with election as easily, but we need to get a little bit smarter on how we make the bad guys, specific bad guys, pay the price.
You highlight one of the hardest ones, is this question within our club, where we set up a set of rules based on a set of assumptions that we could operate by consensus because we were all Democrats here. It's a hard conversation to have about what we need to do in that circumstance if those rules aren't serving us. Others. Ma'am.
Mariam Chikladze, visiting lecturer at JIBA.
Can you
Could
speak
you hold
up
the microphone a little closer to your mouth?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, you and your colleagues, your counterpart organizations are long-standing supporters of Georgia's democratic development. But we can't really shake collective feeling of frustration that, considering the investment, Georgian political actors should be probably more stronger and institutions more resilient. Looking back and looking in retrospect to your democracy assistance, what do you think should have been done differently? Or looking forward, what would you do differently to make democracy support more effective and impactful? Thanks.
I can start quickly.
Sure.
People who are used to doing international development work, they're also used to being frustrated. The United States also spend a lot of money in Latin America, in West Africa, in Asia, where I'm less familiar with the efforts, and the frustrations are common. I don't see the Georgians' progress being as minimal as it feels when you live here. And it's like, when you have a kid in your home and then neighbor tells you, like, your kid is so much taller. And you're like, no, I don't see it, because you don't see your kid every day. There is a progress that has been made here. And there are some qualified individuals that are here right now that we didn't have 20 years ago. And I know progress has been slow. And the problem here is we're also losing a lot of brains, especially in recent years. A lot of judges, prosecutors. My dear friend Natia Kutateladze, who was an appellate judge here, is in the United States. And many judges, prosecutors left the country. They are in New York right now driving Uber. So there is a tremendous problem. These are people that U.S. invested into training and supporting. So there is a tremendous setback there. But I don't think we should be discouraged. I think we still think that the next year is going to bring the better future to the country than any previous year. And I do think we need to invest into monitoring and evaluation systems. So we cannot just come up with the concepts, fully independent judiciary. What the hell does it mean? Who is measuring? Who is deciding? When we come up with those conditions for the country, we also have to have the ability to tell them, these are the ways you measure your fully independent judiciary. And these are the people who are deciding this. Is it decided based on the public opinion? Is it decided what Georgian Dream is telling us? Is it decided based on the civil society groups, international community? Those are the metrics that are vital, what we call things. So I think we should invest more into monitoring and evaluation.
Any quick thought? Yes,
Yeah,
Steve,
I'll
please.
make a comment. Well, in terms of Georgia, we know that there are challenges out there. We're very well aware of the many issues that have arisen. Democracy building is a struggle. It's a long-term effort. But we are going to keep on focused on one goal, and that's to try to fulfill the will of the Georgian people. And what is it that the Georgian people desire the most? That's EU membership. Every poll that we have done in Georgia for the last 15 years, it's the most consistent data point in every poll we've ever done here. And that is the support for EU membership has never varied between 82% and 90%. Think about that. This is the will of the Georgian people. So we at IRI, and I urge all of you to do everything that we can to help the Georgian people fulfill this wish, this ambition. So in the short term, that means getting candidate status, moving forward, building democratic institutions. Let's give the Georgian people what they desire for their families and for their future.
Michal, last critical question?
Yeah,
Miranda,
actually,
anything
it
to
goes
say? Okay.
right after what Stephen said. I also think that EU membership is the greatest both goal for the Georgian people, but also source of leverage. And I think in this case, the West, Europe needs to talk directly to Georgian people, not only to the government. The fact that there is this gap can be and should be exposed. So I think here is where, especially when Georgia is still outside of the club and the government says that they want to join, but they are doing the other way, is to show clearly the process for what it is and make it conditional. So I actually, we'll see whether this is where the Commission and the Council ends up going. But I think it actually will be about showing why Georgia in October is not yet ready to get the candidate status. Not to give also a big present, a big gift to the government, who will definitely pocket that in the election, but actually show that government has done these things right, but have not fulfilled, what the estimate is 9 out of 12 conditions, and talk about it directly as much as governments and Commission can talk directly to the Georgian people to show the reality for what it is and use the leverage for strengthening Georgian democracy in the run-up to EU membership over time.
Let me wrap us up here simply by saying I think one of the most powerful observations, while it is on us to make this case, to believe in this case, the people who have done the most perhaps for our cause are the Ukrainian people, who in the last years have shown us that democracy is worth fighting for. And I think they've inspired people around the world in our community, and we need to take that and learn from them too. With that, please join me in thanking our terrific panel. This has been a really great discussion. Thank you.
Great. John, thank you very much for great moderating panel.